And how, monks, does a monk dwell practicing mind contemplation on the mind? Herein, a monk knows the mind with lust, as with lust, the mind without lust as without lust, the mind with hate as with hate, the mind without hate as without hate, the mind with delusion as with delusion, the mind without delusion as without delusion. So welcome to this series of talks on the four foundations of mindful awareness, known as the Satipatthana Sutta, also known as the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, meaning the great sutta on the four foundations of mindful awareness. And this is, just to remind ourselves, is part of the Pali Canon, or appears in the Pali Canon, which are the early teachings of the Buddha. And this very important scripture is the Buddha's own explanation of meditation practice, both seated and in activities, otherwise known as mindfulness, also known as daily life practice in a Zen practice. And although this particular formulation that the Buddha gives is very analytical, the principles behind it are exactly the same in all Buddhist schools that practice some form of meditation and mindfulness, which is really all of them. So here we have reached the third of the four foundations. Just to remind ourselves, the first two. The first foundation was mindfulness of the body, or awareness of the body and its sensations. The second one was mindful awareness of feeling or sensation. That was pleasant and unpleasant, and also a neutral feeling as well. And we talked about that and its importance in habit formation and in the development of taste, aesthetics as well. And so we now move on to the third one, which is the contemplation of mind. And I think what can be said is that the reason that these four are in this particular order is deliberate. Contemplation of the body is perhaps where we start as regards the practice of mindful awareness, because it's easier to do and it's important to do, because otherwise we get very lost into the world, into the realm of thoughts and ruminations and daydreams. Most of us, we find ourselves pulled along by those thought streams and daydreams a little bit too much, and it takes us away from the present moment, and it takes us away from a sense of openness and connectedness with the world around us. So when we start with the body, because the body is in the world and the body is just pure sensation, it doesn't think, that helps root us into the present moment, because the body is always in the present moment, of course. Then we have sensation, or Vedana as it's known, feeling sensation as it's sometimes called, which can be pleasant or unpleasant, which is a feeling that arises on the input of sense data. So we have pleasant sights and sounds, and we have unpleasant sights and sounds, and we have pleasant smells and unpleasant smells, and we have pleasant thoughts, and we have unpleasant thoughts and emotions too. So we're gradually, as it were, coming sort of inward to a more sort of subtle sense. And by this third one, we are aware of mind. And it's important to be clear exactly what is being referred to here. So I think having some kind of definition and view as to how Buddhism sees mind is very important. And what is important to say is that Buddhism has several theories of mind, not just one. And here we can see that the idea of mind here is being used as something that detects emotional states, or something that contains or witnesses emotional states. Here we have lust, or we could just say the hot desire and craving. We have hate, and we have delusion as well. And as I'm sure most people who are familiar with Buddhism will recognize these three as what are known as the three fires, or the three kleshas, sometimes the three passions, sometimes the three poisons, they're called as well. But these are the afflictions that afflict consciousness, and the Buddha ties them very closely with the cause of suffering, which is what we're going to be looking at. subsequently. But just staying with this notion of mind as well. Now, this term is a translation of the Sanskrit Pali word chitta, Citta. It's normally spelt in the Romanized script. And as you're probably aware, because we don't normally think of the mind being afflicted by emotions, we normally think of the mind connected with thinking and cognitive functions, such as remembering, willing, analyzing, and so on. We tend to think of the heart as the base or seat of emotions. We feel with the heart. And actually, chitta takes into account both of those. It's the place where mental activity, whether emotional or cognitive, takes place. So chitta is has a wider encompassing than our ordinary everyday conception of mind. The other thing that we need to say is that mind as different to brain as well. Nowadays, a lot of people use mind and brain synonymously, as say, or what's I don't know what's going on with my brain. I'm so forgetful, or something like that, my brain feels all over the place. Actually, mind is very clearly the subjective experience of consciousness, and that is distinct from the brain. Now, obviously, in Western psychology, mind and brain are very closely aligned, but Buddhism doesn't really refer to the brain. It's referring to the subjective sense, totally, really, much more along the lines of phenomenology, and as we experience it as a subject. Also, the other thing to say about mind is that, in the Buddhist sense, it is not just contained within the skull or within the brain. In fact, the mind itself is seen as as a sensory organ, in the same way that the eye and the ear and the nose and the tongue and the body are also sensory organs as well. The mind perceives what are called mental objects, and these sort of mental objects, the phenomena of mind, in fact make up the last of the four foundations, what are known as mind objects, or dhammas in Pali, which we will be looking at next time. But mind, so to speak, is the place where this is experienced. And one other point to make, the Buddha was very clear that the mind is not an entity. It's not something that exists independently. Remember that the Buddha was very clear that the sense of self is, or the sense of a permanent self and a separate self, is a delusion. So mind is not separate from mind objects, and neither is it separate from material objects. In fact, either there is a deep interconnection, a oneness with them all. There are other theories of mind, but I don't really want to get too drawn into them, because this is much more sort of practical talk. So we can see from this that the Buddha, in his discussion of this third foundation, is concentrating very much on the emotional state of the mind, or the state of mind, the state of heart-mind, and in particular the connection with these three fires, with these emotional states. And although it's translated here as lust and hate and delusion, lust and hate, we shouldn't think that therefore it's only these very powerful emotions that are in fact being involved. In fact, lust is simply wanting. If we think back to Vedana, to the feeling sensation, which we looked at last time, we can see that wanting and its corollary, hating or not wanting, in fact are extrapolations of the sensations of pleasant and unpleasant. We move towards what is pleasant and move away from what is unpleasant. And wanting and not wanting, or love or lust in this case, and hate, and not just hate but also fear, represent those two movements towards something, an object of desire, and away from an object that is loathed or feared. And notice how hate and fear Buddhistically are treated exactly the same. They have the same motion, the same aversive movement, away. And then we have this third one as well. We have this third one that's called delusion as well. And perhaps most people might be sort of thinking, well, don't really sort of think of delusion as an emotional state as such, but actually in Buddhism it very much is. And this is the delusion of attachment, in particular the attachment to the notion of myself or a self. And it can demonstrate itself, for example, in opinionatedness. So my opinions is a very obvious one. And if you think about how heated we can get in and through our opinions. I mean, if somebody openly contradicts or expresses an opinion that I don't like, I can actually feel threatened by that, as if somehow somebody had, was attacking me or holding a weapon to me, and that our emotional reactions definitely become involved. Our opinions can become very heated and very quickly indeed. And the other thing to say is that actually not all emotions are hot. As we know, hate can be cold as well. What is it that they say? Revenge is a dish best eaten cold. That's true too. And fear has a paralyzing or numbing effect as well. But it's still very much one of the kleshas, one of these passions, one of these fires. So don't get, although the translation into English, words like fires and passion and so forth have this sort of connotation of heat, just to be aware that we're talking about any emotion, any powerful or gripping emotional state there. Now, the thing about these three fires, as the Buddha called them, or the kleshas as they're called in Sanskrit, is that we see them also at the center of the wheel of life. They drive the wheel and its 6 realms of rebirth. If at the very center of the wheel, they are symbolized by the cockerel, which represents greed, the snake, which represents aversion or hatred, anger, and the boar, the male pig, that represents delusion. That the first two are probably fairly obvious, but the delusion is the boar, because the boar apparently uses its tusks to throw soil over its head to get rid of the parasites on its back, and sometimes that soil can get in the eyes so that it blinds it and it can't see temporarily, and hence the delusion. So that's where the symbolism comes in. Anyway, so those 3 fires are at the center of the wheel and they drive the wheel. So the Buddha was very clear that these fires drive the wheel of rebirth, drive the wheel of suffering as well, because this is rebirth in samsara. Again, if we're not familiar with these terms, we can always sort of go and look them up. There's plenty of material on the Zen Gateway about that too. But for our purposes anyway, what's very clear is that these 3 fires that afflict the mind, afflict the heart-mind, they are the drivers of future becoming, whatever that may be. And so perhaps what we can usefully do is to just look a little bit at the nature of these 3 fires, see how they do actually drive things along, and the way that they can distort reality and thus lead to suffering as well. And we talked about anger and said that it was sort of synonymous with fear too, and very clearly, fear can change the way that we perceive the world. Perhaps the most famous parable of the Buddha's to that effect is the parable of the rope, where the man at the time of the Buddha traveling home at twilight, sees what across the road what he thinks is a snake, and jumps back and jumps back to run away. But the Buddha happens to be standing there, and the Buddha represents clear seeing, all the truth. And the Buddha says to him, look again. So he looks again, and what he thought was a snake, he sees in the twilight was actually just a piece of discarded old rope lying across the road, and sense of relief. And he goes to step over it when the Buddha says, pick it up. So he picks up this rope and brings it close to his eyes in that darkening light, and realizes that what he thought was a piece of old rope is not. It's a string of gems. And he's, overawed. And of course, it was always a string of gems. And that's all we really know about the parable. But, perhaps we can extrapolate a little bit. But after all, this is India. Snakes, poisonous snakes like cobras. One has to be wary of them, because if they bite you, particularly at that time, you're a goner, and it's a very painful death. So perhaps someone had said to him, I was walking down that road a month ago, and I saw a snake, and we think we've forgotten that, but those sorts of fears that we hear that and that but it sits at the back of the mind, and we're walking down the same place. That's the condition, the precondition, and we're not necessarily thinking about anything fearful, but seeing an ambiguous object in the gloaming, so to speak. The imagination, the feared, gripped imagination, projects onto that ambiguous object its fear. It sort of comes alive. It stands up in front of one. And this shows actually, in a sense, the playful nature of the emotions. The Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung tells a fascinating story about a professor friend of his who was working in his study and looking after his 3-year-old daughter. And in those days, toys were scarce. And he gave the little girl 3 sort of spent matchsticks, and she was playing quietly in the corner whilst he was working at his desk. When after about 20 minutes, there was a shriek went up from the corner of the room, and the little girl turned to Daddy and said, "Daddy, Daddy, take the witch away, take the witch away." Now, what had happened? And what had happened is that the little girl was playing the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel and the witch, which is, of course, the old story of the witch in the gingerbread house. She traps the children, and she's going to eat the boy, and she's enslaved the girl, and so on. And Jung explained what had happened, that the girl had become so engrossed in her game. She knew that it was a favourite story. It's so engrossed in her game that at some point the emotion that it was invested in the game tipped over, and suddenly the witch stood up as real for her, and that's when she shrieked and said, "Take the witch away." And if we think that's somewhat fanciful, well, it's no different to going to watch a horror film at the cinema and screaming, at a shock or something horrible that's happening on the screen. I mean, we know it's not real. We know it's pretend. But when the emotions are heightened in that way, I cannot help myself. I am gripped by them, quite literally. I am gripped by the emotion, gripped by the affect, gripped by the fire. And then they are real. The fear becomes real, or the wanting becomes real, or the hatred becomes real. This is how a skillful orator can turn a crowd as well, for example, by seizing the emotion and reaching it up to fever pitch, at which point then minds and hearts are won over, which can be a good thing, or it can be a terrifying thing as well. But in fact, that shows the quality of emotions. And this is why, if we are subject very much to fearful thoughts, for example, then our bodies physiologically react as if we are genuinely being threatened. There was a book that came out a few years back, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, showing that every day zebras face, hordes of predators after them, and they may be involved in a chase for their life. But as soon as the threat is over, then they stop being frightened and they just go back to what they were doing before, munching the grass on the plains. But if it was a human being, and here I am sitting in a room. If the door opened and in walked a big cat, and I would be jumping up very quickly, this talk would come to an extremely fast conclusion. And let's say I managed to get out the window, or I managed to get out unscathed somehow. The zookeeper was called, who then sort of takes the lion away. What would I be like after that? Would I then just go, oh well, it's late now, time for me to go to bed, or would I be awake for half the night? Would I have nightmares? Would I need counselling? Quite possibly. I don't know. Would I need to have anti-anxiety medication? But what's the difference? How come the zebra can get away with it and we human beings can't? And the difference is that we have the capacity to replay all that. We have the capacity to reimagine it. And as we reimagine something physiologically, it affects us as well. This is what happens in trauma. Of course, PTSD. People relive the events and they go through the same reaction or trauma again and again and again. This is this fear, although it's happening purely in the mental realm, in the imaginal realm, it is incredibly powerful. And this is the reseeding. This is why the Buddha said that these passions have a tendency or drive rebirth, because the rebirth is the re-exposure to the trauma, the re-exposure to the trauma, and so on and so forth. Now, we don't have to be traumatized in order to do this. We can experience these things with wanting and not wanting. Think, for example, about if there's someone that we really fancy or someone that we really love, we play a fantasy and we allow ourselves to experience, wished for or willed for outcomes, future outcomes. And perhaps if we've fallen out with somebody, we can re-experience or reimagine future encounters with them when we humiliate them or get one over on them or win the argument with them. And we replay that again and again and again. These too are considered as rebirths. And we can get stuck in a cycle of this. And if it becomes extremely powerful and overly done, then it begins to affect the personality as well. And this is what can lead to what I like to call making a pact with our little fiery devils. And this is something that can happen when we have found that actually we have a certain coping mechanism. And I can think, for example, of someone who learnt quite early on in their life that when they faced a situation that they didn't like or frightened them in any way, that if they fell sick, then they could get out of it. They were excused, and they had learnt that quite early on. And what had happened is that they'd sort of made a pact with it. They'd sort of, wouldn't say that they necessarily faked it. Maybe they did a little bit at the beginning, but after a while, it sort of built up a head of steam. And what they found was that whenever they were in a situation in which they were uncomfortable, or it meant them having to face something that was a little bit too difficult or that they feared, they would genuinely fall sick. They would develop actual psychosomatic symptoms. And this had really blighted their lives, because it meant that, because we all have to face circumstances that are difficult, and so they would become genuinely scared that they were going to fall sick, because they inevitably did. And this is what happens, because in the old folklores of folk tales of making a pact with the devil promises you, your heart's desire, but then after a period of time comes and demands your soul. And in the same way, the passions can give you something really, can give you something that you want, like your own way. Like it can, your emotions can learn to manipulate other people so that you can get what you want. But then there's a payback for that. People begin to avoid you, people mistrust you, you get a reputation as being manipulative or having a hair trigger temper or being unreliable. You sort of we can fall into a sort of feedback loop in this way, and this is the danger of that way of behaving. So becoming aware of these mechanisms that we have inside us, this is all part of what's known as encountering our shadow, because a lot of these pacts, so to speak, are semi-conscious or even unconscious. They were made so long ago, often when we were very young, that they've conditioned our behavior ever since, that we know that they're sort of, we might know that there's a problem from the user end, so to speak, but we have no idea why they keep happening to us. And it's not until we begin to develop this mindful awareness of the passions, of the fires, that we begin to see all the causes and conditions that go together to actually make them up. Now, perhaps you're beginning to realize that actually with all these foundations of mindfulness, in fact, and particularly with this one, that the Buddha's therapy, so to speak, is to apply the Four Noble Truths to this, that there is a cause to our emotional conditioning, that it can also be changed, it can be stopped, and there's a way to actually do that, which is via the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the practice of meditation, the practice of ethical behavior or having good form, for example, developing sensitivity to boundaries of behavior, and also through that, through learning to bear our own emotions, learning not to always have to act out our emotions, we gain two things. One is that we gain the ability to choose how we're going to behave in a situation rather than being driven by, well, to use the language here, lust and hate. Because when that happens, of course, we try to avoid what we hate, don't we? Because it's unpleasant and Vedana takes us away. And then we've created a no-go area. I can't go back and, see that person because they distress me too much. Or I can't face that situation. Or even something as simple as, I can't face the journey to work on a busy underground, and it's interesting right now in this sort of, as we're coming out of the whole COVID lockdown thing, there's a lot of fear about, isn't there? We've been conditioned to feel fear for a long time by many authoritative forces, and we've got ourselves into a state of suspicion and heightened sensitivity and fearfulness for our own well-being, that a lot of people are finding it difficult to try and readjust back to coming out of lockdown, for example, and moving about again and getting on public transport without feeling scared and anxious. And of course, the way we have to do that is through a gradual exposure back to these things again, learning to bear that fear, and just learning to do it. Learning to hold to it, and we can use meditation. Obviously, we've done our research and we follow our guidelines and all that sort of thing. We know, the scientists are coming back and sort of saying, or some are anyway, saying, well, we're okay to move about now and we can do these things now. And partly we need an element of trust, obviously, because if we don't trust the information that we're getting, then it's very difficult, obviously, if not impossible, to act on it. But on the other hand, the other thing that we need to do is to actually do it. And one of the things we might find is that we develop delaying or procrastination in order to avoid these. This is just part of the sort of avoidance. But what if we learn to recognize that avoidance, then not to make a pact with it, not to go along with it, but actually develop strategies, because we realize that to succumb to these in the long term will mean that our life will be made a lot poorer, and we will be restricted. We will have less choice in how we live our lives. A life that is driven by the passions is a restricted life. And I think that's something that's really important. This is the connection the Buddha made. A person who is driven by the passions is not free, because I do not choose the passions. The passions choose what I will face and what I will not face. And the stronger that they are, the more driven I become by them. This is at the heart of that sort of both obsession and compulsion as well. So this sort of shadow work, this getting to going into those places that perhaps I would prefer not to see and not to look at, tremendously important and interesting. Just to finish with that in this, what we call in Zen working with the fires, because that's what this third foundation is. In this working with the fires, we really have to come to grips with perhaps a darker side to ourselves, find ourselves, perhaps not as pure, not as holy, as not as upstanding as I perhaps would like to think so. And that has a two-way thing. One is that we dismantle the judgment, the self-judgment, but at the same time, we also become compassionate towards the foibles of others as well. And that allows us not to necessarily tolerate bad behavior, or to say not, or to say, bad behavior is okay and fine and we don't have to worry about it, but to be less unforgiving, or perhaps more forgiving when it comes to weaknesses in oneself and in others as well. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now. And as I see you next time for the fourth in these four foundations.